Hello everybody, this is going to be a short video and it's a review on my book Berlin 1945 bis 1953, which means from 1945 to 1953. This book is exactly the same as this one. This book is written in English, this one's written in German. And it's just a review of the book. Now I must say that Curt Riess has done a fabulous job with this book. I think this book has long since been deleted, sadly I would say, because it really gives a deeper insight as to what happened after the end of the war. There are many books written on World War II. Understandably, it played such a role to world history, European history, Berlin history, that we get a deep understanding, and so there are many great books written. So if you wanted to spend the rest of your life reading about and watching documentaries about World War II, I mean, you have so many different sources and so many different points of view that there'll always be something new to discover and to study, whereas post-war doesn't seem to have the same kind of glamour or the same kind of interest as World War II does. My concern is pretty much what happened after the war. We all know that it became the Cold War, but there was a lot that we don't know. You'd have to look for books like this, and you'd have to go and do your own investigating by reading some of the books that perhaps are not written in English. You might only have access to them in German. So this book is really an overview by the author Curt Riess, who himself is a Berliner. He came from Berlin and he moved to the United States when he saw the writing on the wall, and then he came back into Berlin at the end of the war. So he must have been shocked, as Marlene Dietrich was, because Marlene Dietrich was so upset that she couldn't hold back the tears. But Curt Riess didn't quite have the same attitude. I know there was a person that he was looking for, because he recognised his house, and of course it'd been destroyed and bombed out. And when he managed to get someone who knew this particular girl, where she had lived, and they said that she sadly perished as a result of the bombs raining down, and so they were able to get into the cellar where they were. And when they go into the cellars, what they do is they have buckets of water, but that's really not going to help much. You really need to have a fire engine with a great big hose in order to put out the fire. And sadly, as the bombs rained down, it created a fire, and all those that were in the cellar with this particular lady who Curt Riess once knew perished as a result of the fire. And he said that he was looking down in the cellar on the floor. He said it was all sand. He said, "Gosh, this is sand." He said, "This is sand." And she said, "No, that's not sand. That's bone." Because the heat was so intense that the bones burnt, and it purified into sand. So I mean, he was quite shocked, and he said, well, after that, he said, "Yeah, let's go." So that was one incident, and it was many incidents like this. He would go into an apartment, and he would manage to talk to all the people that were actually living in the apartment blocks. Each one had their story to tell. So consequently, he was able to get a deeper insight on a personal level that perhaps that you wouldn't read in a newspaper article. So he's very personable to the kind of people that he would talk to. It wasn't all dignitaries and functionaries and politicians and military personnel and people like that. He would talk to everyday people. And the thing that comes up again and again was the cold. It was bitterly, bitterly cold. Now I just come into Shane's, and I couldn't believe how cold I was. It took a while for my hands I get movement in my hands because it was so cold. Now imagine that being cold all the time. There's no heating. So you're living in a cellar, or you're living in a room where you have to share the room with another family. You know, that you don't always have access to water. You've got to have a communal toilet. Most of the building is destroyed, or the part of the building is habitable. The rest of the building is not. You know, like the roof could be missing, and you've got all the elements coming in. You know, the rain, the sleet, and the snow, and the winds. The doors don't shut properly because as the bombs landed, they kind of distorted. So the buildings, even though they stand, they're kind of now distorted, so that the doors won't shut properly, and then there'll be doors that they just had to take them off the hinges because the doors wouldn't shut. So they had difficulties with that. Then they had difficulties with food. There wasn't enough food to feed the population. You had the refugees coming in from Eastern Germany and from East Prussia. They needed somewhere to stay, and they probably exposed to the elements. And then you have, because there was no gas or very little electricity, they would then have to cook the food out in the open air. So you would actually see people, you know, having a couple of bricks and then being able to, you know, have a little stove where they can heat the food. And the food was mostly made of bread and potatoes. So they had a lot of bread and potatoes, and that was their diet. And ersatz coffee. They had a lot of ersatz coffee. So this was what they were going through, and of course they had the black market. So you had to have the black market, and the currency at that time was cigarettes. So if you had enough cigarettes, you could use that to barter in order for you to supplement the ration cards that you got. Some of the people got ration card 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. 5 is like the worst. I mean, you couldn't live on ration card 5. But there were some people that had to and survive as best they could. But you had a lot of people that either died, you know, children that starved to death because there wasn't enough food. And then you had the suicides, which continued. There was quite a lot of suicides, tragically, consequently, because of the situation that they found themselves in. Curt Riess said he had to get out of the city. He had to go to Switzerland, or he had to go to Paris just to get out of the city because it was so depressing to live there before he actually would go back to Berlin. Jeep, for example, when he was driving around in a Jeep, he always had to have a person sit in the Jeep because he was fearful that somebody would actually start taking things off the Jeep that they could sell. You know, steering wheels, headlights, tyres, anything, you know, so that the people could survive. It's really, I mean, it's a really desperate time. Then there were those that did exceedingly well, you know, all those, the apparatchik and people that had influence, they would do well. They'd have good food to eat that they got from the black market, especially the Americans. The Americans would have the parties, and Russians too. They'd have these parties, and they'd have caviar there, and they'd have cognac, and they'd have whiskey, and they had all sorts. And it was like those that were invited would eat their fill because they didn't know when they would get their next meal. So it was really kind of desperate times. Then you know, the other thing about Berlin at that time was there was hardly any electricity, gas. There was you couldn't, if you don't have that, you would have to go to bed early, or you'd be sitting in the dark if you didn't have any candles. There was hardly any furniture because they'd always use the furniture to make fires just to keep warm. So there was hardly anything in there. And then there were obviously the Russians. The Russians would help themselves to everything that they had. So they would go to the factories, they'd dismantle all the machines, and then they would ship them off to Russia. And some of them never got to Russia. You know, they would sort of rot away in a railway carriage somewhere, and it never get to its final destination. So you had situations like that. Also, the Russians were looking for scientists, and if they could find any scientists, they would just bang on their door, and then they would say "Schnell, schnell, schnell," which means quickly, quickly, quickly. Get your clothes on, fill up a suitcase, you're going to Russia. So all these people would be dragged out of their beds at 2 o'clock in the morning, having to go to Russia, because Stalin wanted them for whatever reason, you know, being able to make the atomic bomb, that was for one, and for any innovation, and because of the technology in Germany at the time, because they were able to make jets. At that time, at the end of the war, it was they didn't have that technology at the time. So that was a real shock to the system, and sometimes these people never came back. Also, there were these kidnappings, because Berlin was split up into zones. You had the Soviet zone, they had the largest chunk, and you had the American zone, the British zone, and at the end they had the French zone. The French zone got the worst districts of Berlin. It was the badly bombed area of Berlin, because they kind of just invited the French at the last minute, so to speak. So they didn't really have that much influence, as much as, say, the British and the Americans. So they just got you know, a district of Berlin that wasn't very it wasn't something that they were too pleased about, but at least they got into Berlin. That was the main thing for them. So yeah, kidnappings were going. So these people from Russia, you know, whether they were secret service men or secret police or whatever, would go over into Western Berlin and kidnap somebody. Then they would take them back to the eastern side of Berlin, and then they would appear in court, and then, you know, you wouldn't see them again. They just disappear. Where they got sent to a gulag somewhere, you know, Siberia, wherever, you'd never see them again. And this was something that was quite common. So we had a lot of that. So a lot of the police, they wouldn't communicate with each other. So there was bad animosity between the two sides. Consequently, a lot of crime was being committed simply because these people were literally having to survive. So I think I've gone on too long, a bit too. I wanted to keep this video short, and you know, I don't want to give everything away in this book, because this book's well worth reading. So if you get a copy of this book, I'm sure you'll be able to find it, and you get it in English, you'll be able to understand a lot of actually what occurred in Berlin between the year of 1945 and 1953. And with that, auf Wiedersehen.